The wind howled across the emerald hills of air, keening like a widow beneath the blackened sky. Mist clung to the earth like mourning cloth, creeping along the crags of the ancient stone and swallowing the moonlight whole. In this land of blood and prophecy, of fire and bone, there was a name whispered not in prayer but in fear, the Morrígan. She was no goddess to be worshipped with sweet hymns or golden altars. She was war incarnate, a fate weaver, a harbinger. Her voice rode the wind before battle. Her shadow darkened the eyes of kings, and where she walked, nations bled. This is her story, but beware, it is not a tale of heroes. Before swords sang and spears shattered shields, before the wailing of the banshee reached mortal ears, the Morrígan was already watching. She had always watched. Birthed of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, the Morrígan was no simple entity. She was a triad, a trinity of dread. Badb, the battle crow. Masha, the swift and cruel. Nemain, the frenzy. 3 faces, 1 soul, 1 force. But she was more than the sum of her parts. When she whispered in your ear, you thought it your own thought. When she stood behind you, you never turned, because something in your bones remembered that to see her was to see the end. Even the mighty Dagda, the good god of the Tuatha, who could tame storms and giants alike, found himself in awe of her. One Samhain night, he found her at the ford of the river Unius, washing the blood from her body. Stark, wild, beautiful in a way that burned. Her hair clung wet to her back. Her eyes were the colour of war. She smiled. The Morrígan had seen the coming of war with the Fomorians, the monstrous sea raiders whose breath stank of salt and rot. She offered her body to the Dagda as a pact, for power, for union, for foresight. He accepted. But he never truly knew her. No one did, no one could. For the Morrígan did not belong to gods. She did not belong to men. She belonged only to fate, and fate was never kind. In the battles to come, her presence was unshakable. On the eve of the second battle of Mag Tuired, when the Tuatha De Danann stood poised to reclaim Ireland from the Fomorians, she appeared to the warriors not as a maiden, but as a raven atop the cairn. Her call was not that of a bird, but a scream, a death knell. They say that when Nuada the Silver-Handed stood beneath her gaze, his breath faltered, that even Lu, the long-armed warrior god, dared not meet her eyes, for she had already seen the outcome, and it was written in blood. As spears soared and swords found flesh, the Morrígan danced through the battlefield, not in form, but in force. When Badb shrieked, warriors went mad and slew their kin. When Nemain whispered, legions turned to chaos, ranks dissolving into carnage. Macha raced ahead of chariots, laughing, her hair a banner of red. The Tuatha won that day. The Fomorians were broken. Baela the Evil Eye fell beneath Lug's spear, and when the final cry faded, the Morrígan raised her arms to the heavens and declared the land free. Her voice rolled across Ireland like thunder. But freedom, like fate, was never without cost. The dead outnumbered the living. The soil drank deep of Irish blood, and as mothers screamed over the bodies of sons, as kings buried their dreams with the fallen, the people began to wonder, was the Morrígan truly on their side, or had they merely served her purpose? Still she walked, unseen but ever near. In the forests, the rivers, the battlefields, her form changed with her will, a hag one moment, a shimmering beauty the next. She visited heroes before their end, sometimes to bless, more often to doom. Cuchulainn himself, the Hound of Ulster, would one day taste her judgment, but that tale too waits in the shadows. For the Morrígan is not just a goddess of war. She is the embodiment of fate's cruelty, of inevitability, of endings no blade can stop. She is prophecy made flesh, and she is far from done. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our other videos for more intriguing tales and discussions. The saga continues in the next part of the Morrígan, goddess of war and fate. Blood in the Ford. The land did not sleep. Though victory crowned the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorian yoke was broken, a quiet unrest stirred beneath the surface of Ireland. Smoke still clung to the sky, curling like the fingers of the dead. Carrion birds circled overhead, and among them One raven flew lower. She watched. From the shadowed tree line of the battlefield at Mag Tuired, where bones steamed and spears jutted from corpses like weeds through frost, the Morrigan walked in silence. Her bare feet left no print. Her hair shimmered like crow feathers slick with the rain. Where her fingers brushed a dying man's lips, breath fled. Where her shadow fell, blood darkened. She passed among the wounded, not with pity but with purpose. To the mortally torn she whispered names, those who would soon join the host of the dead. To the still breathing she offered prophecy, though they did not know it. A flicker of a touch, a glance, the faintest echo of her voice in their minds. Your thread is frayed. The gods forget you, die gloriously or die forgotten. And to those she favoured, the truly damned, she offered a gift, madness. Not far from the battlefield, the river Unius ran thick and red. It was here she often came after great slaughters, when the veil between worlds grew thin and blood called to blood. Tonight the air was still, the smell of iron was thick, and the mist curled in great wreaths along the banks. She knelt by the water's edge, dipping her hands into the current, letting the crimson swirl around her palms like fate itself. Behind her came a rustle, not of leaves, but of armour. She did not turn. She'd felt him long before his approach. Lu, the warrior of the long arm, slayer of Baelor, champion of the Tuatha. His presence was light and fire, sunlight caught in steel, and yet even he hesitated when he saw her, kneeling there in the blood-drenched ford. "You've come to drink from the river?" she asked, not turning, "or to look upon your work?" "I've come to understand," he said, voice steady. "You promised us victory, Morrigan. You promised freedom. But this..." He motioned to the land behind him, to the corpses, the charred earth. "This looks like ruin." She stood. Her full height was not imposing, but her presence bent the world around her. The raven feathers woven into her cloak rustled in a wind that did not blow. Her eyes were storms behind storm clouds. "Victory," she said, her voice smooth and cutting, "is never clean. You could have warned us, guided us. We might have saved more." She stepped closer, each word a thorn beneath his skin. "You don't understand your place, Lu. You were not born to save lives. You were born to end them. That is why I touched your cradle. That is why I whispered your name before you ever spoke it." He swallowed hard. "You claim to serve the Tuatha. I serve the weave." She raised a hand, and for a moment, Lux saw it. The tapestry. It shimmered behind her like a veil of starlight. Threads of gold and crimson, black and silver, twisting endlessly into a web that stretched across the land and beyond. Lives, wars, victories, deaths, all woven in divine madness. The Morrigan touched a single thread, and Luch flinched as something in him shifted. Pain, deep and sharp. "You will die young," she whispered, "but legends will bleed in your name." He looked into her eyes, searching for defiance or perhaps mercy. He found neither. "Do you take joy in this?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "I take purpose," she said. "Joy is for children. I am the blade beneath the skin of time. I am the scream behind the silence. I am the last face the dying see." She stepped past him. Behind her, the river churned. Far away in the kingdom of Ulster, the seers were dreaming dark dreams. They saw a chariot thundering across red hills, a hound with blood on its jaws, a woman standing beneath a tree singing a lullaby to bones. The Morrigan was not finished. Her eyes had turned to the north, to a child grown into a warrior, to a name she had spoken before even the bards could sing it. Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster. He did not yet know it, but she had marked him, and fate would demand a heavy toll. The Hound and the Crow. In the wild hills of Ulster, where mist clings like breath to the throat of dawn, and the earth echoes with the footfalls of ancient kings, a shadow moved across the path of a warrior. Cuchulainn rode hard, his chariot wheels cutting deep into the dew-wet soil. The horses, black as night and wild-eyed with power, snorted steam into the morning air. His charioteer held the reins tightly, sweat beading across his brow. Though the morning was cool, there was no pursuit, only the weight of something unseen. Cuchulain's spear, the fabled Guy Bulg, rattled against the wood of the chariot. He gritted his teeth. His dreams had been thick with fire and shadow, of a woman in black, hair like wings, lips like blood. He would not say her name, not yet. The old tales warned of what happens when you summon her attention, and worse still, when you already have it. The road twisted through a narrow pass, cliffs rising like teeth on either side. Ravens circled above, croaking low in the grey light. Cuchulain narrowed his eyes. One of them broke from the group and dropped lower, wheeling in slow circles over his path. He knew. His voice was a growl beneath his breath. "She waits." The charioteer glanced up. "Who?" "She who watches," he said. "She who weaves." A shape emerged ahead, standing directly in their path. A woman, tall, cloaked in black, her hair long and wild, skin pale as old bone. Her eyes burned like dying stars. She did not move as the horses barreled toward her. "Hold!" Cuchulain barked. The chariot groaned as the reins pulled taut, hooves scraping, stones flying. They stopped inches from her form. She did not blink. Cuchulain stepped down, spear in hand, heart thundering like war drums. "Name yourself." The woman tilted her head. "You know me." "I know trickery," she smiled. "Then you know me well." The wind shifted. The ravens above cried louder. The grass seemed to recoil beneath her bare feet. "I've no patience for omens or riddles," he snapped. "Speak your purpose or begone." She raised one hand and from her sleeve spilled feathers. Black, slick, endless. They fell like ash around her. "I have seen your death, Cuchulain." He did not flinch. "Every warrior dies," he said. "Not every warrior lives long enough to make death regret it." He stepped closer, spear lowered but ready. "Speak plainly, Crow. You ride toward a battle you cannot win. Not by strength, not by skill. Then I'll make the gods weep when I fall. Do you think I came to warn you?" Her voice curled like smoke, soft and cruel. "I don't care why you came." He turned to climb into the chariot. "I came to offer you a choice," she said. That stopped him. "Yield," she said. "Let the battle pass you. Leave the glory to lesser men. Live, love, age, die a man, not a myth." Cuchulain laughed, hard and sharp. "I was born in blood. I will die in it, but not with your name on my lips." He climbed aboard. "Begone, phantom." Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but with something colder. Disappointment. "You will meet me again, Hound of Ulster, but I will not come as a woman next time." He drove on, leaving her standing alone in the road. The charioteer dared speak. "You knew her?" "I did." "Why not take her off her?" "Because I'm already dead. She just hasn't finished weaving the thread." That night, under a blood moon, Cuchulain drank water from a nearby river. Tasted of rust and shadow. A cow appeared in the woods, strange, bleeding from the flank. He chased it off. Later, a young girl with one blind eye begged him for a ride. He refused her. Then came an old woman with a broken leg and a pail of milk. She offered him a drink. He accepted. He did not recognize her in these forms, but the Morrígan had kept her word. At dawn, as battle roared on the horizon and warriors clashed on the plain, Cuchulain stood ready. His body already knew betrayal. His soul already ached with fate. The crows waited in the trees. One watched from a higher branch. Not Badb, not Masha, not Nemayin. All of them. One, the Morrígan. She did not warn him again. Now she would only watch. And when he fell, when the Guy Bulg had struck its last blow and his blood painted the earth of Ulster, she would perch upon his shoulder, silent, eternal, and whisper his legend to the dying. The thread snaps. In the grey stillness before the clash, the world held its breath. Across the open field of battle, warriors stood like stones planted in the soil, spears bristling, armour glinting with the dew of morning. Hounds barked in the distance. Shields trembled in calloused hands. Somewhere in the silence a child wept, and at the centre of it all stood Cuchulain, the Hound of Ulster. His face was calm, but his eyes, they burned, not with fear, nor with fury, but with something deeper, the certainty of purpose, the knowledge of doom. He had ridden through the night like a wraith, his wounds unseen but already festering. What he'd taken for the sting of battle had festered beneath his skin. Not poison, not blade, but fate. He did not speak. He did not pray. He simply waited. And the Morrigan watched. She stood upon a boulder at the far edge of the field, her figure cloaked in black feathers. To mortal eyes, she was but a raven. To the dying, she was far more. No one saw her eyes as they followed him. No one heard her breath catch when he first lifted the gay bulg in defiance of the oncoming tide. She had seen thousands die. She had whispered in the ears of kings as they bled out beneath the sky. But him? He did not die like the others. He danced. The enemy came in waves, swords raised, voices hoarse with hatred. And Cuchulainn moved like a storm unchained. His spear lanced through hearts, his blade screamed through bone. Blood splattered across the grass, warm and bright. The warriors around him fell like wheat to the scythe. None could touch him. None could match him. For a time, even death dared not approach. And still, the Morrigan waited. She could feel the weave stretch, taut, trembling, thinning. His thread pulled tighter with every breath, every kill. She had offered him mercy, not out of pity, but respect. He had denied her. So now he would earn her presence fully. 3 warriors came, brothers in arms, famed for their unity and cruelty. She had whispered in their dreams the night before, twisting their hearts with hatred and promise. Together they met the hound in the centre of the field. He killed the first with a blow that shattered bone. The second pierced his side, but died gurgling on his own blade. The third struck the wound the old woman had touched, the wound the cow's horns had marked, the wound her magic had laid bare. Cuchulainn stumbled. The gay bulg fell from his hand, and the sky above him darkened, but he did not fall. He dragged himself to a standing stone, tall and jagged, old as Ireland itself. With trembling hands he lashed himself upright, binding his arms with the sinews of his own chariot. He fixed his gaze forward. His lips whispered no curse, no plea, only defiance. There he stood, bleeding, broken, tied upright like a sentinel, and the enemy hesitated. For hours none dared approach. The crows circled, the wind howled low, but the Morrigan, she, descended. The earth seemed to still beneath her feet as she approached the bound warrior. Her form shifted, no longer a crow nor a crone, but something liminal, a figure that shimmered between beauty and horror. Her hair flowed like oil down her back. Her eyes held both storm and silence. Her presence sucked the sound from the air. She stood before him. Cuchulainn did not move. "You die well," she said. He bled from the mouth, the nose, the countless cracks along his skin, but he smiled. "Took you long enough," she tilted her head. "You always knew this would be the end." "I knew it when I heard your voice the first time," he said, teeth pink with blood. "When you whispered from the shadows of my cradle." She stepped closer, so near now she could smell the iron in his breath. She placed one hand upon his heart. "Then tell me, Hound of Ulster, was it worth it?" He coughed a laugh. "I live in stories now, don't I?" The Morrigan's lips parted, not in cruelty nor kindness, but in something that might have once been sorrow. She leaned close. Her voice brushed his ear. "Yes." She kissed his forehead, and with that the thread snapped. His body sagged, still bound upright, still defiant even in death. His enemies watched from afar, afraid to approach even then. The Morrigan rose. She lifted her arms to the sky and let loose a cry, a long, piercing wail that split the air and sent every living thing to its knees. It was not grief, it was prophecy. The hound had fallen, but his legend would remain, and so would she, watching, waiting, weaving. Far away a child heard the cry and turned to his mother. "Who was that?" The woman didn't answer. She pulled him close and whispered, "That was the Morrigan, child, and tonight she sang for a king." The weave beyond death. The stone to which Cuchulainn's body had been bound stood tall for 3 days and nights, defying wind, rain, and time. Birds perched upon his shoulders, yet none dared peck his flesh. Wolves crept close, only to whimper and flee. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath in reverence, not for the man, but for the myth. and through it all, the Morrigan watched. From atop a hill crowned with ancient yews, she gazed upon the battlefield now silent, the corpse-bound stone below, and the weight of the tale she had helped to shape. Around her the land pulsed softly, like a heart at rest. Her cloak whispered against the wind, made not of cloth, but of shadows and stories. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. In the other world, Tir na Nog, where the air tastes of honey and starlight and time walks backwards, the gods stirred. The Dagda sat upon his stone throne, his face unreadable. Brigid wept into her hands. Lug, once radiant, stood still, a shadow falling across his golden skin. "You knew," he said to her, when she entered the hall of the Tuatha De Danann, trailing silence in her wake. "I wove it," the Morrigan replied. Her voice was neither apology nor pride. It was inevitability. "He was kin," Lug growled. "He was my blood. Your word could have saved him." "No one is saved," she said, "only remembered." He stepped toward her, but she did not move. No one touched the Morrigan, not even the gods. Her presence was not mortal, not divine. It was truth in its rawest form. "He trusted in fate," she continued, "and fate gave him immortality." "Immortality in tales," Brigid whispered, "but cold ashes in the earth." The Morrigan turned her gaze to the fire at the centre of the hall. In it she saw the moment Cuchulainn tied himself to the stone. The blood, the breath, the silence that followed. "He defied the world," she murmured, "and the world remembers those who do." Outside the realm of gods, in the mortal lands of Ulster, the bards began to sing. Not one song, hundreds. They sang of a boy who took up arms too young, who slew a hound and became one, who defied armies and gods alike. They sang of the woman who walked beside him, sometimes lover, sometimes enemy, always watching. They did not call her by name. They called her the Crow, the Washer at the Ford, the Nightmare Queen. And so the Morrigan slipped deeper into the fabric of memory, not forgotten, only transformed. But legends are not made solely of songs. In dark places her name still echoed as a curse. On battlefields she still appeared, her form ever changing, a shrieking raven, a red-haired maiden bathing in the blood of the fallen, a hag smiling with broken teeth as kingdoms collapsed. In the hearts of warlords she whispered glory and death in the same breath. In the ears of dying heroes she sang softly, not cruel, not kind, just honest, and to the mothers who wept over their sons, to the wives who heard the wind cry their husbands' names, she was the shadow behind every answerless prayer. The Morrigan walked the land still. She did not age, she did not change, but she remembered. She remembered Cuchulainn, not for the blood, but for the fire. She returned often to the stone where he died. There no flowers grew, but the wind carried songs. His soul was not trapped, not mourned. It was folded into the weave, into every tale of defiance, every cry of war, and she kept weaving, because fate, unlike gods or mortals, does not rest. One dusk, a girl came to the river. She was young, barely past childhood. Her hands were calloused, her eyes too old. A raven flew low above her and landed by the water's edge. The girl knelt, washing the blood from her clothes in silence. "You see me?" the Morrigan said, her voice like wind in bone. The girl did not look up. "I've seen you in dreams. Dreams are truths wearing masks. I know who you are. Then why do you not flee?" "Because I want to know what comes next." The Morrigan studied her. "You're no warrior." "I will be." She approached the girl slowly, her bare feet silent on the river stones. "You seek glory. I seek purpose. You will find pain. I welcome it." The Morrigan bent, her mouth near the girl's ear. "Then we begin again." And so the thread was tied anew. Not in the past, but in the present. Because war never sleeps, and neither does fate. The loom of shadows. In the hollow hills where the stones speak only to those who listen, and the rivers sing in tongues older than stars, the Morrigan returned to her loom. Not of thread nor wool, but sinew, bone, breath, blood. The fates of mortals hung there, delicate as cobwebs stretched and taut. Some gleamed bright with destiny, others darkened with rot and betrayal. Each thread sang in her ears, whispering names she had not yet spoken aloud. She had just begun weaving the girl's thread. The one who came to the river. Her name was Aoife, born of no great line, no royal blood. A farmer's daughter. A girl raised on famine, on silence, on the ache of watching brothers march to wars they would not return from. Her mother had no songs to sing, only warnings and grief. But Aoife had fire behind her eyes, and the Morrigan had heard it in her voice. I welcome it. So the goddess watched, not as a mentor, not as a protector, as the tide, to see who drowned and who learned to breathe below it. Aoife trained in secret, with wooden staves and kitchen knives, with silence as her ally and wrath as her companion. She did not fight for justice. She fought because there was something inside her that could not sit still. She fought because fate had looked at her. She saw the Morrigan sometimes in the trees, a crow too black, a woman in the water, a whisper on the wind. She never spoke to her again, not yet. But the silence between them deepened, and within it grew power. In the west, the sons of Connell waged a war without cause. Raiders in silver-plated helms swept across the countryside like fire, devouring crops, taking slaves. Their banners bore the twisted sun, the mark of false kings. Aoife's village burned under such a banner. She returned from the glen to find her mother crucified upon the doorframe, her body blackened and broken. Smoke licked the sky. The well ran red, and on the roof of the longhouse sat a crow, watching, waiting. Aoife took nothing with her but her mother's carving knife. She did not cry. She did not scream. She walked into the forest, and never looked back. The Morrigan followed, not as shadow, but memory. Every step Aoife took echoed within the goddess. Every wound she suffered, every man she killed in the back roads, in the silence, beneath moonlight, each added a new thread to the loom. The first kill was crude. A soldier relieving himself, his sword hung on a tree branch. Her knife found his throat. The second was cleaner, a knife under ribs, pulled up. The third did not die easily, and Aoife, bleeding and half-crazed with pain, lay beside his corpse under the rain and finally whispered, "Are you watching?" The crow in the tree did not answer, but she stayed. In time, bards began to speak of the Red Maid, a ghost that haunted the edges of war camps, a girl with hair soaked in gore and eyes like knives. Soldiers claimed she could not die. That, even when spears pierced her, she laughed. They said she ate hearts, that she bathed in blood. The Morrigan smiled at such tales, not because they were true, but because they were becoming true. Aoife was no longer a girl, she was a story. The day came when the Morrigan returned to her fully. Aoife sat at the base of a dolmen in the mountains, her hands stained, her breath ragged. 7 dead men lay around her. Her left arm was broken, her lips split. She was still smiling. "You called," the Morrigan said. Aoife looked up slowly. "Was it enough?" The goddess tilted her head. "Enough for what?" "To matter." The wind pulled the feathers of Morrigan's cloak sideways, her face, as ever, unreadable. "You are noticed," she said, "but you are not yet named." "Then name me." A pause. The loom trembled far away. Another thread began to twist. "You will bear a name," said the goddess, "that terrifies those who make war, and tempts those who run from it." Aoife did not nod. She only stood. Blood dried on her face like war paint. The crow circled above, and in distant halls the gods whispered to one another. "She is mortal," they said. "She is broken," others claimed. "She is dangerous," said Brigid. But the Morrigan, seated in the shadows of the otherworld, smiled. "No," she murmured, "she is mine." For fate is not always written. Sometimes it is carved into the bones of the willing, and Aoife, she had offered herself to the blade, the making of a war name. The stars turned red that night. Not with fire, but with blood memory, ancient and eternal, smeared across the sky like wounds that refused to close. Beneath that darkening dome, Aoife knelt on sacred ground, the hill of slaughter, where the Tuatha De Danann once warred in silence and storm. The grass here had never grown green, only black. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Her blade lay beside her, cracked near the hilt. Her armour, piecemeal and scavenged, hung from her like a skin not meant to fit. Yet her eyes held the stare of someone who had already died and chosen not to remain in the grave. And so, the Morrigan came to her again. Not in secret this time, not in whispers, but in full, terrible form. She appeared on the summit, wrapped in a cloak of screaming shadow. Feathers and smoke coiled around her like vipers. Her hair, blacker than storm-torn midnight, fell to her hips. She wore no crown, only a circlet of thorn and bone. Before her, the air turned still. The winds of Ulster stopped. The trees held their breath. Even the gods dared not interrupt. And Aif, blood-soaked and hollow-eyed, looked up without kneeling. "I have cooled," she said. "I have bled. I have burned. Do I have your attention now?" The Morrigan stepped forward. The earth beneath her bare feet withered. "I watched you kill your name," the goddess said. "The girl Aif no longer lives." "Then what am I?" The Morrigan circled her like a wolf, slow, graceful, hungry. "You are an instrument," she said. "You are what I forged in the crucible of grief and fire. You are purpose, walking." "Then give me my name," Aif demanded, "the one I will wear into legend." The goddess stopped. There was silence. And then, "You will be called Scáthgra, Shadow of War." The name rippled through the air. It burned itself into the stone beneath her knees. The ravens cried above them, 1,000 wings rising like blackened flame. Aif, no, Scáthgra, lowered her head, not in submission, but in ritual. "I will be your blade," she said, "your voice in the dark, your terror on the wind." "No," the Morrigan whispered, stepping closer. "You will be your own blade. You do not serve me. You are me." And then, with a single touch to Scáthgra's brow, the goddess vanished into feathers and storm. The next day a warband disappeared in the eastern pass. Soldiers found only a blood trail and a tree adorned with severed tongues. The Red Maid was gone. In her place, a myth was born. Scáthgra, Shadow of War. The name spread like rot through the courts of false kings. Warlords hired sorcerers to bind her spirit. Priests whispered prayers to the sun god, hoping light could burn her from the shadows. But no light reached her. No chains held her, because she was not a ghost. She was a story whose ink was blood, and stories once told cannot be undone. One king, Ardan the Merciless, clad in obsidian and gold, offered 100 heads of cattle and a castle to any man who brought him Scáthgra's heart. Not her body, just her heart. 12 mercenaries left his hall that night. Only one returned. He brought a bundle wrapped in black silk. Inside, a cow's heart, carved into it with the tip of a bone blade. "Try harder." In the shadow of her growing legend, the Morrigan worked her loom. Thread by thread, she stitched Scáthgra into the tapestry of Ireland's fate. But this thread was not obedient. It tangled, it resisted, it cut back. It was beautiful. For centuries, the goddess had guided fate with cold precision, measured, deliberate, unyielding. But Scáthgra was something else. She was chaos, sharpened. And even the gods began to ask, had the Morrigan created a champion or a rival? On the 7th moon after her naming, Scáthgra stood before a lake black as night, its surface like obsidian. She looked at her reflection, expecting to see the girl who buried her mother. Instead, she saw the shadow of a goddess behind her shoulder. She did not turn. She simply said, "You made me." And from the lake, the voice came. Not from lips, but from the world itself. "No, you made yourself. I only watched." Scáthgra smiled. Then she stepped into the water and vanished. She walks still, through dreams and battlefields, through the hearts of those who ache for war but do not know why. She is seen in flashes, reflected in the blood pooling beneath a soldier's dying breath, in the curve of a blade drawn with intent, in the eyes of a woman who has lost everything and yet rises. She is not a goddess, she is not a ghost. She is what remains when fate sharpens its edge and decides to strike. And the Morrigan, she no longer weaves Scáthgra's thread. She merely watches, because every once in a while, even fate must learn what it means to fear. When goddesses bleed thunder rolled across the plains of Connaught, not from storm, but from hooves. War had come again. 3 kings, 2 armies, a single crown. Their war drums beat like the pulse of a dying god. But the land did not tremble for them. It trembled for her. They had summoned the Morrigan, not with prayers, with blood. A child king, no older than 16, was nailed to the gates of his own keeper's tribute. His eyes were left open, his tongue severed and burned. Upon his chest, in blood not his own, the 3 kings had scrawled an offering. War, all of it, yours. And so, she came, but not alone. At the height of the battle, as the 3 armies converged beneath a sun too red to be natural, a black mist rolled across the field. It moved like thought, like vengeance unspoken. Men choked, horses screamed, and then her laughter. Not beautiful, not melodic. A sound made for undoing. The Morrigan walked out from the smoke as though it parted in reverence. Her hair coiled around her like wings. Her eyes were no longer human. They were pits of battle, bottomless and lit with flame. Every soldier on the field fell to one knee. Not out of loyalty, out of instinct. And yet, as she looked across the gathered men, a flicker of something passed over her face. Not satisfaction, not hunger, not wrath. Absence. Where was she? Where was Scáthgra? It had been months since her thread vanished from the loom. The Morrigan had searched in still waters, in dying breaths, in bones buried beneath blackened trees. No trace. Not even a whisper of her name remained in the wind. A silence unnatural. It wasn't death. Death sings to the Morrigan. This was something else. She feared nothing. But she noticed now, in quiet moments, that she was listening for footsteps, for that low, dangerous laugh, for the chaos that once mirrored her own, and it was not there. Still, the kings demanded her allegiance. They approached her with blades drawn, not in threat, but in supplication. Choose who shall rule, they begged. Choose whose banner will rise. But the Morrigan no longer cared. She looked through them, as one might look through smoke. This war is without soul, she said. One king dared to answer. It is for power. She turned her eyes on him, and in that moment he saw the face of every man he had killed, each mouth open in eternal scream. He fell, choking, convulsing on his own name. The other 2 fled, but war had already begun. And the Morrigan, out of boredom more than vengeance, loosed the frenzy. She raised her arms. From the sky, Badby descended, a red mist screaming like 1,000 harpies. Blades turned on allies. Mothers slew sons. Orders crumbled. She whispered, "Nemain!" and the ground shook with madness. Archers fired into their own lines. Generals wept and clawed their eyes free of lies. And then she ran, as Matcha, across the battlefield, a blur of fury and speed. She killed without lifting a blade. Her touch turned bone to ash. Her voice cracked helmets. The field became a grave. And still, Scáthgra did not come. That night, beneath the burnt sky, the Morrigan returned to the hill of slaughter. The stone was cold, her loom untouched. She stood there in silence, and in that silence, she wept. Not for mortals, not for kings, for herself. Because something within her, something long buried, ached. She missed the fire that talked back. The war that didn't bend. The mortal who had once said, "You made me." And now, the Morrigan, goddess of war and fate, felt a truth like a dagger beneath the ribs. She was lonely, but fate abhors longing. So the loom twitched. A single thread pulled tight, Scáthgra's thread, singed at the edges but unbroken. The Morrigan froze, and then she screamed. A cry that shattered glass in distant temples, that tore open the night sky and cracked a mirror in the court of the gods. Scáthgra was alive. Somewhere far beyond the veil, in a place between life and myth, the shadow of war stirred. She was not the same. She had passed through something even the gods feared, and she was returning. Not to serve, not to kneel, but to challenge. For even fate has its reckoning, and the Morrígan Raquel would soon learn what it meant when a creation becomes a storm. The shadow returns. The veil between worlds was thin that night, not broken, worn, like old skin or rusted armour, torn by the weight of something rising from the other side. The Morrígan stood alone upon the jagged cliffs of Cruachan, where the wind shrieked and the sea below clawed endlessly at the bones of giants. Her cloak billowed around her like smoke without fire, her eyes fixed not on the ocean, but beyond it. Something stirred across the weave, a place uncharted, a space that did not belong to gods or men. Her fingers gripped the edge of the cliff, knuckles white. It was not fear, it was recognition. Scáthgra had returned, but not from death. No, from beneath it. Somewhere in the marshes of forgotten Ulster, mist curled unnaturally, thick as sin and heavy with silence. No birds, no breath, no moonlight. And in the centre of that lifeless mire, she rose. First a shadow, then a shape, then a woman. Scáthgra pulled herself from the earth like a blade unsheathed from centuries of stillness. Her skin was pale as tombstone, etched with new marks, ancient spirals, war sigils, not carved by man. Her hair hung in damp tangles. Her eyes, no longer entirely human. There was something divine in them now, not gifted, stolen. She did not speak. The bog bubbled beside her. A bird landed on a twisted branch, then burst into cinders. Scáthgra stood tall, and she began to walk. The land remembered her. Trees leaned back. Rivers slowed. The very air recoiled as if some old agreement had been violated. Because death, to the gods, was a passage. To Scáthgra, it had been a crucible. She had passed through realms uncharted, wandered where souls were unformed and names were never meant to be spoken. There, in the black between gods, she had learned. Not from books, not from spirits, from silence. And what she brought back with her was not entirely hers. The Morrígan knew before the sky split. She knew when the bird stopped crying, when her loom snapped a thread not from fraying, but from rejection. Fate had blinked, and Scáthgra had stepped outside it. The goddess rose from her seat beneath the great yew tree and whispered, "She comes for me. Not in hate, not in vengeance, in completion." They met again at the ford of Unius, where blood once stained the waters, where the Morrígan had kissed Cuchulain's brow and whispered his thread closed. Now she stood ankle-deep in the river again, the same moonlight silvering her shoulders, her cloak trailing into the current like oil. Across the water Scáthgra appeared, no longer hiding in rags or rage, no longer the girl who had called herself Aif. She wore no armour, no crown, just a long dark coat of leather and sinew, her hands bare, her blade unseen, but felt in the air around her. The Morrígan spoke first. "You stepped where even gods dare not tread." Scáthgra stepped forward. "You made me to be war. I made you to be remembered." "No," Scáthgra said, voice low as thunder. "You made me so you'd never be alone." The Morrígan flinched, not visibly, but eternally. Something in her chest cracked. This was not a weapon returned to its master. This was a reflection, walking. And reflections always cut deeper than swords. Scáthgra stopped at the river's edge. The water did not touch her feet. "I know what I am now," she said. "I know what you feared I would become." The Morrigan's voice was softer than mist. "A rival." Scáthgra shook her head. "No, not your rival, not your heir." A pause. "Your equal." The river grew still. Not a ripple moved. A hush deeper than any silence passed through the land, as if creation itself was watching. And then the Morrigan stepped forward. Water hissed beneath her. Her face held no mask now. Not beauty, not terror, not madness, only truth. "You come to take my place?" Scáthgra answered with the calm of a coming storm. "I come to stand beside it." The goddess looked upon her, this mortal who no longer was, this shadow forged in blood and grief sharpened on the whetstone of death, and saw herself. Not her past, not her future, her mirror. and for the first time since the First War the Morrigan smiled. Together they raised their hands, the weave twisted, the old threads surrendered, a new pattern began. It was not neat, it was not kind, but it was unbreakable. Across Ireland, ravens screamed with joy. The soil breathed. The dead listened. Because war was no longer one voice, it was two. Two shadows, two fates, one legend. And from that day on, when soldiers fell and death whispered in their ears, they no longer heard a single voice. They heard a harmony, a prophecy sung by two goddesses in the dark. And Ireland would never be the same again. The gods remember long before Scáthgra walked from death, long before Cuchulainn bound himself to stone, even before the Tuatha De Danaan's feet pressed the soil of air. There was war, and she was already watching. They do not tell this story in the great halls, not in Tara, not in Macha, not even in Tir na Nog. This tale was buried by the gods themselves. The Morrigan was not born, she was torn, from the screams of the first dying king, from the breath of the first betrayed brother. From the silence that followed the first murder no god dared claim. When the world was young and the gods still argued over who would name the rivers and who would command the winds, there came a night when none of them could sleep. Because something moved in the dark. Not a beast, not a god. Something older than all of them. She who sees. She was not called Morrigan then. She had no name, because names belong to the living, and she was not. She was fate before language, she was war before purpose, and the gods feared her. Dagda was the first to approach, not with spear, not with spell, with bread. He offered her a meal upon the banks of the river Unius, his voice gentle, trembling beneath his godhood. "Join us," he said. She looked at him and said nothing, only smiled. That night, he dreamed of 10,000 battlefields, of crowns split by axes, of children born beneath screaming skies. He woke sweating. She had touched no food. She had taken his future instead. But the gods learned. She could not be banished, not bound, not buried. So they invited her in. They gave her a seat among them, not high, not low, outside the circle. Never one of the ruling, never one of the ruled. The Morrigan became their necessary monster, the divine fail-safe, the one who would whisper endings. And so, she watched them all. Brigid, goddess of healing, watched her temples rise and fall. Manannán, god of the sea, watched his sailors drown as she walked the shores. Lugh, god of skill and war, bled beneath her gaze and still never earned her favour. Even Danu, the All-Mother, looked into her daughter's eyes and wept, for she saw no womb, no future, only the end of things. They accepted her place only because they feared the cost of denying it. But now they feared something worse. Scáthgra, a mortal who was not meant to rise so far, a creation that did not bend, a mirror that reflected too much. The Morrigan had always been the last voice, the final face, the whisper of what must happen. But Scáthgra had gone off thread. She had returned unchained, and the gods felt it. In the great hall of Phélias, where the 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann are guarded by breathless druids and unsleeping spirits, the gods gathered. Lugh leaned against a pillar of thunder. Brigid clutched her fire close, her eyes uneasy. Diansec sharpened a blade already too sharp, and the Dagda, ancient and quiet, asked, "Has she turned against us?" The room hushed, not out of reverence, out of dread, because the question was not about Scáthgra, it was about Morrigan. Brigid, voice like wind on a battlefield after the dead have cooled, said, "She made the girl in her own image. She made a second herself," Lugh muttered. "Or worse, a conscience." "No," said the Dagda. "She made something she could lose to." The gods debated not war, but containment. Some spoke of exile, some spoke of chains, some whispered names not heard since the first drowning, ancient gods from the Fomorian depths, gods who fed on forgotten things, who would hunger for a goddess that tasted like death, and a mortal who smelled of defiance. But the Morrigan was already listening. That night, while the gods plotted under their sky of stolen stars, she stood again at the ford of Unius, and she waited. Not for Scáthgra, for the gods to come for her, She knew what they saw, a broken pattern, a goddess unravelling, a second voice in the halls of fate. But they were wrong. She had not made a mistake. She had made a successor, not to die for her, but to stand against her if necessary. Because even war must be reminded of its cost. Even fate must fear its mirror, and the gods? They had forgotten what fear felt like. Scáthgra arrived before dawn. No horse, no escort, just the wind in her hair and the ghost at her back. She stood beside the Morrígan in the shallows, eyes fixed toward the east. "Do they come?" she asked. "They do," the Morrígan answered. "Then we greet them as queens." "No," said the goddess. "We greet them as endings." Somewhere the gods began to descend. The air trembled, the earth prepared to break, and two shadows stood at the river's edge. One born of fate, one who stepped beyond it. One thread. Now, two. But soon, the loom itself would burn. The gods break bread, the thread burns. The sky did not darken when the gods arrived. It did not thunder, it did not cry. It listened. Because for the first time in memory, not even in legend, gods came not to judge mortals, nor to bargain with spirits, but to confront one of their own. And she was not alone. At the ford of Unius, where so many deaths had passed into tale, and so few names had returned from it, the Morrígan stood ankle-deep in the water, still, silent, barefooted as always, as if to remind the world she belonged to it and not above it. Beside her, Scáthgra, no longer mortal, not divine, something else, something born of the gap between what is fated and what refuses to be. She did not bow when the gods arrived. She did not even blink. First came Lu, the long-handed warrior. His armour glimmered like dawn breaking on a sword's edge. He carried a spear that never missed. Then Brigid, her breath scented with ash and honey, her hands calloused from centuries of healing. Behind them, defiance, blade forger, wound mender, god of blood and bone. Last came the Dagda, heavy with knowledge and shame, his club dragging furrows in the earth. His eyes, once warm, now clouded with the weight of old choices. They stood in a crescent across the river from the Morrígan and her reflection, and none spoke. The gods did not summon lightning or prophecy. They summoned a table, with no throne, no chalice, no ritual, only bread, fruit, and water. The Dagda gestured, and they sat. All of them. 2 goddesses of fate, 4 gods of the weave, and across that still river, under the same sky, they shared silence. "You made her," Brigid said first. The Morrígan tore bread. "No, I shaped what was already rising. She's dangerous. So am I." Lug spoke then, voice sharp but careful. "You made another fate weaver, another endbringer." "No." The Morrigan's eyes met his. "I made a choice, something the weave does not allow." defiance folded his arms. "And if she weaves against us?" Scáthgra spoke now, her voice low, steady as a blade being drawn. "Then you'll bleed." The god stiffened. But the Dagda did not flinch. He turned to the Morrígan. "You fear us." "I remember you," she said. "You tolerate fate when it suits your cause, but when it begins to speak in another voice, you silence it," Scáthgra finished. Brigid's hands tightened. "War is your domain, Morrígan. Death, prophecy, yes. But this?" She looked at Scáthgra. "You've made something outside of balance." The Morrigan's smile was cold. "There is no balance in prophecy, only the illusion of inevitability. And now we must decide," Lug said. "Whether to strike her down," defiance added. But no one moved. Not yet. Because beneath their words hung a deeper fear. They weren't deciding if Scáthgra should exist. They were deciding if free will should be allowed to stand beside fate. Then the Morrígan rose. She walked into the river until it kissed her hips. The moon carved her silhouette in silver. "You think I forged a sword to slay gods?" Her eyes met Brigid's. "I forged a mirror." She turned to them all now, no longer cloaked in shadow but in truth. "For aeons I have served what must be. I watched kings slit their sons' throats because the stars told them to. I whispered in the ears of women as they poisoned their husbands because the dream demanded it. I stood by as Cuchulainn tied himself to stone, because it was written. She pointed to Scáthgra, but she said no. She walked the spiral into death, and instead of fading, she came back changed, not defiant of destiny, but aware of it, willing to wield it, or break it, the river whispered. The thread of time rippled, and in the stillness the gods saw what Morrígan had always known. She had not broken the weave. She had taught it to bend. Scáthgra stood. Her voice echoed like the hush before a battlefield erupts. You are afraid because I am not like you. I was not born into power. I had to fight for it. I had to bury for it. I had to die for it. She walked across the shallow water, slow, steady. And I do not want your thrones. She stopped before them. I want the right to exist, without your leash, without your whispers. Her eyes found Lugh. Because what is fate, if it demands silence? The silence that followed was not heavy. It was sacred. The Dagda broke it first. He poured water into a stone cup, handed it to Scáthgra. She drank. The gods, one by one, followed, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She would remain, and so would the goddess who made her possible. That night, beneath stars unblinking, the loom trembled. Not from defiance, from change. A second hand now worked the threads, not to undo them, but to test their truth. Fate was no longer a single voice. It had become a dialogue, and somewhere in the dark a new thread began to spin, not of war, not of death, but of choice. And the gods, they would have to learn a new kind of reverence, because the age of prophecy was ending. The age of possibility had begun. The cracking of the old name, the wind shifted, not in direction but in memory. It blew across the plains of air like a ghost unchained, passing over sleeping hills and battle-scarred fields, over cairns piled with the bones of kings and rivers that still sang with blood. And as it moved, it whispered, a name not spoken since before the Tuatha De Danann crossed the silver seas. Anu, not the Morrígan. Anu, they had forgotten. The gods, the druids, the seers, the shamans, all had buried her first name beneath titles of terror. Morrígan, the phantom queen, the battle crow, the washer at the ford. But before she was those things, she was Anu, the first mother, the dark root, the fertile void from which all endings bloomed. She had been divided by myth, fragmented by worship, reduced to a puzzle of death and frenzy. But now, as Scáthgra moved through the threads of fate with her own hand, the cracks in the old name widened. And Anu remembered herself. It began with a vision. The Morrígan, Anu, stood before the mirror pool atop Ben Bulben's shadow, the sky above her starless, her breath made of frost. In the still water, she saw not one face, but three. Her triple form shimmered, Padb, shrieking, blood-drunk, naked in red mud. Macha, proud, swift, her face smeared with ash, laughing with cruel joy. Nemain, whispering madness into the ears of kings, her eyes endless voids. But behind them, her own face, the face she had worn before war, before fate, before even death. And she wept. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Morrígan wept. Scáthgra found her there. She did not announce herself. She sat beside the goddess like a daughter, like a rival, like a shadow come home. You remember, Scáthgra said. I never forgot, the Morrígan replied. I only buried it. Why? Because a goddess of war cannot be seen weeping for what she once was. Scáthgra looked into the pool. But now you're more than war. No, the Morrígan smiled, tired and sharp. Now I am all of it. The gods had called her Morrígan for so long because it made her controllable. A force of nature, yes, but predictable. Now she was not. And Scáthgra's emergence had forced the transformation. Not rebellion, reclamation. News spread, first through ravens, then through breath, then through dream. The old name, the true name, Anu, rose from the dead like a buried blade unearthed. Witches whispered it. Priests choked on it. Seers heard it in the rustle of leaves and dared not speak it aloud. And in secret places altars once abandoned flickered with fresh flame. The phantom queen had returned, but she no longer wore a mask. In Tir na Nog, the gods gathered again, this time not in threat, in awe. The Dagda stood in silence. Brigid lit no fire that day. Even Lugh, ever proud, ever sure, stood with his eyes downcast. "She has broken the old name," he said. "No," said the Dagda. "She has made it true again." In the mortal realm, Scáthgra walked through battlefields not to kill but to watch. Her presence still brought fear, but also pause. Men lowered blades when they saw her. Not because they knew who she was, but because something in them remembered what it meant to be watched by fate and not judged. She offered no prophecies. She offered a choice, to kill with meaning, or walk away from the thread altogether. Not all chose wisely. Some tried to kill her. They disappeared, others knelt. She did not accept worship. "I am not a god," she said to one warlord who begged to make her queen of all Munster. "I am a mirror. Stand or see what you truly are." And so the world began to shift. The weave itself no longer held a single rhythm. It pulsed now, a strange harmony. Two weavers, two voices. Anu, once the ending. Scáthgra, once the mortal. Now neither could be easily defined, only felt, in the pause before a blade is drawn, in the dreams of kings who fear the future, in the voice of a woman who says, "No." The Morrígan did not die. She was never meant to. She changed. She shed her fear, her roles, her titles, and when she walked the earth now, the land did not scream. It listened, because Anu had returned, and this time she did not walk behind fate. She stood before it. The gods now looked to her not as the end of the song, but as the composer, and Scáthgra, she walked beside her, not as an echo, but as a chord. Two voices, two legacies, one name reborn, Morrígan. Not death, not destiny, but the freedom to shape both. The crow and the flame. There are places in air where the wind does not blow, where the grass does not grow, where the sky holds its breath and the stars refuse to shine. These are the places the gods avoid, not because they fear them, but because they remember them. There war was not waged with swords or flame, it was waged with words, with choices, with the sound of a thread being cut. It was in one of these places, on the plateau of Sliab Namban, the mountain of the women, that Brigid came to find Anu, and Scáthgra, the goddess of flame, poetry, healing. Brigid, daughter of Dagda, keeper of sacred fires, walked alone through mists older than sin. Her golden hair was bound in a single braid, and her feet, though unshod, made no sound. She came not with anger, nor with pride, but with questions that even the divine had no answer for, and the crow was already waiting. Scáthgra stood at the edge of the cliff, 1 foot over the void, cloak fluttering behind her like a wound unravelling. She did not turn when Brigid approached. She did not move. She had not slept. She did not need to. Brigid stopped a few paces behind her. "There is a sickness," Brigid said. Scáthgra's voice was low, nearly lost in the wind. "Isn't there always? This one is different, not of flesh, of the weave." Now Scáthgra turned. Eyes not glowing, but depthless. Pupils black as peat bogs, laced with threads of fire. "What do you think I am, Brigid?" "A rupture," Brigid answered. "A fire without a hearth. A crack in the bones of the world." "And yet," Scáthgra smiled, "you came alone." Brigid stepped closer. "I came because I no longer know whether to fear you or follow you." Behind them, the Morrígan emerged. Not from shadow this time, but from the earth itself. She rose through the soil like a tree long buried, her limbs dry with age but her eyes younger than any dawn. "I told you," Anu said, "she is not a weapon." "She's more than a weapon," Brigid replied. "She is contagion." Anu tilted her head. "You think she spreads dissent?" Brigid looked at Scáthgra again. This girl who had walked beyond death, come back with no allegiance, offered no prayers, yet stood shoulder to shoulder with a goddess unclaimed. "She spreads choice." Brigid sat on a stone. The mountain did not shift beneath her. It listened. She looked at the two of them, one forged in the womb of divinity, the other in the crucible of pain. "Do you know what the other gods are saying?" Anu answered. "They say the weave is unravelling. They say your loom no longer holds the world in order, that where prophecy once breathed, now it chokes." Scáthgra's gaze didn't waver. Maybe the world should choke. Brigid studied her carefully. You would undo fate? No, Scáthgra said. I would invite it to speak. Brigid stared into the fire between them. There was always fire, even when none had been lit. The flames danced in strange rhythms, not wild, conversational. Fate has always been a current, Brigid whispered. Now it feels like a river flooded, directionless. Anu smiled. Perhaps direction is the illusion. And then something happened the world had not seen in eons. Brigid wept. Just a single tear. Not for herself, but for the children yet to be born. The ones who would not be shaped by divine pattern. The ones who would not be led, but would have to choose their own songs, their own kings, their own dooms. This is the end of the age of gods, she said. No, Anu corrected. It is the beginning of the age of story. Brigid stood. She looked to Scáthgra. Will you guard it? Scáthgra's hand reached out, not for a blade, but for hers. I will, she said, but not as a goddess. Brigid nodded. Then how? Scáthgra's smile returned, razor-thin, storm-born. As a question, no answer can silence. That night, 3 goddesses sat atop the mountain of the women. One, born of earth and blood, once feared, now freed. One, born of flame and creation, trembling on the edge of a new dawn. One, once mortal, now myth, holding in her bones the war that would never be fought the same way again. And as they sat, the world tilted slightly. Not enough to shake cities, but enough that every child born that night would dream of crows and fire, and would awaken unchained. When stories grow. Teeth. The tales came first as whispers. A child in Leinster who spoke a prophecy in her sleep, of 2 women holding the stars between their fingers, a raven nesting in a burned cathedral in Munster, refusing to fly or eat, waiting for a name no priest dared speak. A warlord in Connaught who heard a voice behind his eyes just before he put his own blade to his throat. No one saw the weavers, but they felt the loom shifting, and in places where silence used to reign, stories began to grow teeth. The world was changing, not with war, not with plagues or thunder, but with narrative. Old stories, the ones the gods wrote in stone, sung by druids, carved into bone, began to falter, twist, reconfigure. Men who were meant to be kings, choked on their own ambition. Children born under cursed stars, lived long, quiet, joyful lives. Women long fated to suffer in the margins, began refusing. What the gods called anomalies, the mortals began calling miracles. In the high halls of Tir na Nog, Lu summoned the seers of the 9 wraths. He demanded an answer. What is this sickness? He roared. What force bends prophecy against its own bones? The seers cast lots. Runes cracked, mirrors shattered. They all answered the same. It is not sickness, it is awareness. And so, Lu came again to the ford of Unius. He came alone. No warband, no herald, only a sword that had killed legends, and a question no one could answer. He found the Morrígan seated upon a stone, her cloak trailing into the water, crows circling overhead like orbiting truths. She did not stand. She did not look at him. You come with steel, she said. Will you try to cut the sky again? Luke dropped the blade. It struck the earth with a sound that was not surrender, but recognition. I have not come to fight. She smiled faintly. Then speak. Luke did not approach. Instead, he looked beyond her, to where Scáthgra stood, arms crossed, eyes dark, not hostile, not welcoming, watching. She was the thread he could not trace, the anomaly, the wild card. And yet, she looked no different from the women who walked the fields barefoot, who raised children in storm-torn valleys, who buried sons with eyes unclouded by gods, and that frightened him more than any war. What is her role? Lug asked. The Morrígan gave no answer, because it wasn't hers to give. Scáthgra spoke. I am not a role. Then what are you? I am a wound, she said, but I do not fester. I reveal. To what end? She stepped forward now, into the river until she stood across from him. To end endings. Lug narrowed his eyes. Do you mean to unmake fate? Scáthgra's voice was steady. I mean to let it speak for itself. without gods, without knives, without veils. And what happens to us, Lugastros, when mortals no longer fear prophecy? You adapt, or we perish, she smiled. Welcome to mortality. For a moment Lug said nothing. He remembered a time when his name summoned storms, when his voice ended wars. Now, a girl who once bled in the mud beneath nameless stars stood before him, and he believed her. He feared her. He respected her. The Morrigan rose then. She approached Luz slowly, her eyes no longer the eyes of war. They were the eyes of Anu, the first, the forgotten. You see now, she said, why I made no throne for her. She does not rule, Lug whispered. She walks beside what rules. The air changed. The crows rose, the water shimmered, and the sword Lug had brought cracked in half without a touch. In the years that followed, the world did not end, but it did transform. Prophecy became possibility. Oaths once written in blood were now made in truth. The gods no longer watched to be obeyed, they listened to be remembered, and when mortals gathered around fires and shared tales of gods, of ghosts, of heroes, of endings, they no longer ended with, so it was fated. They ended with, so they chose. And when those stories grew teeth, the Morrigan smiled, and Scáthgra sharpened them, the birth of the living myth. They called it the Age of Weaving. Not by the gods, not by kings, not even by the druids. The name came from the people, those who had once feared prophecy like plague and fate like fire. Now they carried it, spun it, rewrote it. And though the gods still watched, their eyes had changed. They no longer gleamed with hunger, they glimmered with curiosity. In the far west, in a village clinging to the cliffs above the silver sea, a girl was born who wept not when she entered the world, but laughed. Her mother died in the birthing bed. Her father drowned in the storm that same hour. But the child laughed. They named her Shortcha Eternal, in the tongue of the old tongue. And when she touched the forehead of the mourning midwife, the woman dreamed of a battlefield where no one died, only chose to fall or stand again. The villagers whispered, she is touched by the crow. In the east, where stone circles lie half buried in moss and thyme, farmers began leaving out bowls of dark milk at crossroads again. Not for the dead, for the weavers. And sometimes in the fog, a woman cloaked in black would appear at the edge of the fields, watching. She would say nothing, but the next harvest always came twice as strong. The old ones called her Morrigan, but the children had another name for her now. They called her Anumather, the Dark Mother. Not of endings, but of unknowns, and they were no longer afraid of her. Scáthgra had become harder to find, not because she hid, because she moved differently now. She was no longer bound by place, nor death, nor even myth. She walked in stories now, appeared to those on the verge of becoming legends, or breaking beneath the weight of them. She held the hand of a girl forced into marriage, and the girl bit through the groom's throat at the altar. She whispered to a blacksmith who planned to kill himself, and the next day he forged blades for those too poor to fight. She stood beside a poet in the moment he set fire to his own manuscripts, and she helped him light the match. Scáthgra became the goddess of imperfect revolutions, and her followers, they were not priests, they were doubtful heroes. The gods watched all this with strange, bitter awe. Defiance called it dangerous, Brigid called it inevitable. The Dagda said nothing, but Lu, who had once questioned, now only listened. He sharpened his blades no longer for war, but to test the edge of prophecy itself, and sometimes, when he trained in the shadow of the old trees, he would feel a presence. Two, watching him. He never turned to look. In time, a new story emerged. One no bard wrote, one no druid approved. It began as a rumour, then a song, then a movement, that the Morrigan is no longer one. Not three either, but two. One of shadow, one of choice, one born from death, one reborn from it, and they walk not ahead of fate, but through it, rewriting as they go. The story told of a time yet to come, a day when the gods would be challenged not by blades or curses, but by questions too heavy to ignore. Who decides worth, Who chooses sacrifice? What is the purpose of prophecy in a world where every soul can refuse it? The tale says that on that day, the Morrígan and Scáthgra will stand before all pantheons, those old and foreign, and they will not ask for reverence. Only this. What happens when the story fights back? And in that question lies the heartbeat of myth reborn, because myths were never meant to be prisons, they were meant to be doors. And now, with hands soaked in blood and memory, the Morrígan and her mirror have begun opening them, one by one. And so the world continues, not ruled, not saved, lived, under the watchful eye of the crow and the steel heart of the shadow. The threads that refused to break the loom was quiet, not broken, not abandoned, just listening. For the first time in countless ages, it spun not by divine will, but by choice, and sometimes it hesitated, because the threads now moved on their own, because stories, once passive, had begun to speak back. At the edge of the weave, in the space between becoming and forgetting, the Morrígan sat with her hands open. No threads passed between them, only the echo of names: Cuchulainn, Fergus, Medby, Aoife, Scáthgra, each one a thread, each one a defiance, each one a voice that refused to die in silence. She felt it again that day. That same tremble in the bones of the world, that subtle shift in the weight of the future. Another soul refusing its thread, another human stepping outside the pattern. She did not smile, she did not frown, she simply stood, and walked into the world again. Meanwhile, Scáthgra found herself in a place she had never known, a village untouched by violence, a place where children ran barefoot, where fires were lit for warmth, not for war. And it unnerved her. Peace had never been her element. She had been forged in flame, sharpened by silence, born beneath a sky split with screams, and yet she stayed. She watched the children play with wooden swords. She watched the old sing-songs without lament. She did not speak for days, but the villagers welcomed her, not as a goddess, not as a shadow, just as someone who might protect should the dark come again. And for the first time in her life, or afterlife, Scáthgra rested. But stories do not rest. They breathe, they crawl, they spread. And one night a stranger came, draped in robes of stardust, eyes like smoke and honey. They brought no weapon, no offering, only words. They knelt before Scáthgra as she sat by the fire and spoke. "There are others like you now," she raised an eyebrow. Unlikely, but the stranger nodded. "Some hear voices in battle, some rise from death with memories not their own, some walk out of prophecy and laugh in its face." "Then the loom truly breaks," Scáthgra whispered. "No," the stranger said, standing. "The loom evolves." Elsewhere the gods debated again, but their voices held no fire, no lightning, only wonder, because the world was no longer predictable. It was alive, and the Morrígan, no, Anu, no, all of her names, stood at the heart of it. She no longer needed prophecy. She no longer demanded worship. She had something more dangerous now. Faith. But not in her. In those below. Scáthgra travelled again. Through storm. Through ruin. Through fields blooming with defiance. She found the ones the stranger had spoken of. A blind girl who dreamed in omens, and rewrote them each dawn. A one-armed smith who could forge weapons that cut only lies. A child whose shadow walked ahead of her. Each was a thread. Each burned with potential. Each was impossible under the old rules, and she saw it clearly now. She and the Morrígan had not just opened the door, they had broken the lock. The weave still existed, but no longer like before. Now it danced. Now it asked. Now it wove not just endings, but options. And in the space where stories were born, the Morrígan knelt before the loom. She placed her hand on the fibres and spoke without voice. No more chains. The loom pulsed, threads shimmered, and the old pattern died, not with a scream, but with laughter. Because fate is not a cage, it is a canvas, and she, the Morrígan, no longer paints it alone. Now Scáthgra stands at the edge of the world, not to guard it, but to invite those brave enough to step off the path, to fall forward, to fall free, to fall into their own story, the spiral beneath the skin. Beneath the roots of the world deeper than the gods dare tread, where the bones of forgotten truths lie coiled in silence, there is a spiral, not carved, not etched, lived. It spins without end, without centre, without origin. Some call it chaos. The Morrígan calls it the pulse. She walks here now, not as queen, not as crow, as herself, as Anu, the first wound. Here, where myths are still dreaming of names, where death is a concept and not a decree, where time is soft and warm and bleeding. Her hands brush the spiral, and it responds, not with light, but with memory. She sees every woman who ever defied a prophecy, every scream that unravelled a kingdom, every child who said no to a god, and she smiles, because the spiral lives now beneath the skin of the world, and it's spreading. Above, in the waking world, Scáthgra stands at a crossroads, not of stone, of choice. 3 warriors approach her, one bearing justice, one bearing vengeance, and one bearing silence. Each has heard the stories. Each has come seeking permission to change their tale. They do not kneel. They do not ask for blessings. They ask, "What would you do?" Scáthgra looks at each of them, slow and quiet, and she answers as only she can. "I would listen, and then I would burn the ending they gave me." The first drops his sword. The second rewrites the name etched on his skin. The third says nothing, and walks into the unknown. Each leaves with a thread uncut. Each becomes a new story, not blessed, chosen. The gods no longer meet in halls. They gather in echoes, in twilight spaces, in dream thresholds. They are quiet now, and not out of fear, out of learning. The weavers no longer demand obedience. They now ask questions. What story do you need? What thread will you cut? What ending will you challenge? And mortals, those fragile, furious creatures, have begun to answer back. One day, a stranger arrives in Tara, not a warrior, not a witch, a young man with ink-stained hands and eyes too old. He carries no sword, only a story, and he reads it aloud before the court, a tale of a crow who became a mother, a shadow who became a voice, a thread that wrapped around a god's throat, but loosened before it killed. When he finishes, no one speaks, and then the High King rises and removes his crown. He sets it down before the boy and walks away. This is not surrender, this is not revolution, this is evolution. And somewhere, far from courts, far from stories, Scáthgra finds the Morrígan again. They sit at the edge of a cliff, legs swinging like girls too young to die. They do not speak of prophecy. They do not speak of power. They speak of possibility. And when the sun begins to rise, the Morrígan turns to her shadow. "Do you regret it?" Scáthgra doesn't answer right away. Then, "I only regret that it took so long for someone to listen." The Morrígan nods. Not in sorrow, in agreement. Because fate is not only a blade, it is a question waiting to be asked. And the spiral beneath the skin, it is not a curse, it is the way forward, for those who dare to unravel and remake. And so, the world spins again, not in silence, but in story, not in prophecy, but in possibility. The crow's eye and the world unwritten. The sky cracked open with neither storm nor fire. Just a gap. A tear between what was and what refused to be. It appeared not above mountains or temples, but in the middle of a forgotten meadow, where once a woman had buried a stillborn son and whispered his name into the roots of a hawthorn tree. There, the seams split reality open like old cloth, and through it, the unwritten bled. No one saw it at first. Only the crows noticed. Thousands of them, black feathers falling like night ash, circling the meadow, crying in voices that echoed before sound. One landed atop the hawthorn and looked down with one eye. The Morrigan's eye. Not sent, not borrowed, present. And what she saw inside the gap shook even her bones of prophecy. It was a world without shape, not darkness, not light, not flame, not void, just potential. Every story not told, every thread never spun, Every god that could have been born but wasn't. It should have been still, but it was moving, calling, pleading, breathing. Back in the realm of stone and blood, Scáthgra felt it. She paused mid-step on a lone hillside, her feet dragging twin trails through damp heather. Her head tilted, her mouth went dry. "It's awake," she whispered. Beside her, the blade she no longer used shuddered in its scabbard. The Morrígan arrived first. Not as a woman, not as a crow, not even as a god. She came as presence, the raw weight of every death ever dared. She stood at the edge of the gap and gazed into it with her full face, her true face, the one no god had seen since the first scream of the first murder. Behind her, the land forgot to breathe. Scáthgra came second. She did not bow. She did not ask what it was. She already knew. "It's the weave before the loom." The Morrígan did not turn. Her voice was bone dry. "It calls for a story." Scáthgra stepped closer. "Or it becomes one on its own." That was the danger, because a world without direction does not remain empty. It fills itself with echoes, with hunger, with chaos masquerading as fate. The gods feared it. Mortals could not even perceive it. But Scáthgra and the Morrígan, they understood it, because they had both once been unwritten themselves. The question was not, do we seal it? The question was, do we enter it? "What happens if we do?" Scáthgra asked. The Morrígan looked at her, not as a reflection, not as a successor, but as equal weight. "We stop being remembered." Scáthgra's smile was the sharp edge of certainty. "Then let's become something instead." They stepped through, together, hand in hand, and the gap closed behind them like a door that never existed. For days nothing moved. No raven flew, no flame burned. The world stood still in its knowing. But then, quietly, softly, irreversibly, new stories began to sprout. Not told, not passed, grown, in children who dreamed of empty skies and woke with wings, in warriors who dropped their swords and painted murals on castle walls, in crones who died smiling and returned as trees, and across the earth, whenever someone said, "I don't know where my story goes next," a black feather would fall at their feet. No sound, no promise, just the invitation to write it. And the gods, they no longer feared the unwritten, because now they joined it. Far beyond names, beyond pages, beyond war and fate and flame, there is a space where two voices whisper without end. One asks, "What if?" The other answers, "Then let's see." The Morrígan is not gone. Scáthgra is not lost. They are where every true story begins, at the edge of the page, the godless thread. Years passed, though the word year meant little now. Time, once held together by ritual and sun shadow, was fraying. Not dissolving, evolving. Calendars still turned, seasons still cycled, but the weave no longer dictated their meaning. Now it asked, and mortals answered, not with obedience, but with story. In the high north, where wind wore down stone and stars clung low to the earth, a child was born under no sign, no eclipse, no omen, no blood moon, no prophecy. The druid said nothing, the gods said nothing, but the crows came, dozens of them silent still, watching from the frost-covered trees, and when the child opened her eyes they reflected only the sky. She was raised without faith, not in rejection, but in absence. No one taught her the names of gods. She did not know of Morrígan. She had never heard of Scáthgra. No altars burned for her, and still she felt them. By the age of 10 she could hear threads, not like songs, like truths unravelling. She would stare at someone's shadow and murmur, "You're about to leave your husband," or "You don't die here, wait one more step," and always, always, she was right. She never claimed magic, never called herself a seer. She only said, "I listen." In the east an old scribe found her. He carried no sword, only parchment and a single question. "Who taught you?" The girl looked at him, calm and unblinking. "No one." "Then what are you?" She touched her chest. A thread that taught itself to spin. He named her Kale, the hollow thread. But she never used it. She preferred no name at all. The gods stirred. From the far reaches of their now quiet halls they watched. Lug frowned. Brigid wept. The Dagda whispered to stone. They did not know what she meant. She had no prayers, no shrine. But she moved with intention. And when she walked through war camps, men forgot their reason for blood. When she sat beside dying queens, the queens smiled. And when children dreamed of her, they stopped fearing the dark. The Morrígan did not return. Neither did Scáthgra. Because they had never left. They were within her, not as spirits, as memory embedded in possibility. Kale was the godless thread, a being who belonged to no myth, yet carried the weight of all of them. She was not worshipped, she was followed, by those who wanted a third path. Not prophecy, not resistance, but self-weaving. One night, a thunderstorm split the sky open, and a man with fire in his mouth and murder in his hands sought to kill her. To prove the old gods were still supreme, she did not run. She looked at him and simply said, "This is not your thread to cut." He collapsed, weeping, not from guilt, but from the unbearable freedom of forgiveness. The old myths began to fade, not erased, absorbed. The Morrígan became a lesson, not a commandment. Scáthgra became a path, not a destination. And Kale? She became the unknown voice in every mind that asked, "Must I follow, or can I forge?" The gods did not die. They released their grip, and the world moved forward, not godless, not divine, but awake. And if you ask the wind in the north, if you whisper at the edge of a mirror or dream with your feet on the riverbank, you may hear her say, "There is no fate, there is no freedom. There is only the story you choose to believe. The last thread is a flame." It began as a single ember, no larger than a heartbeat, no brighter than the memory of lightning behind closed eyes. It floated through the void between stories, where all tales eventually dissolve or take root, and with each breath of a mortal who dared to ask, "What if?" the ember grew, until it was not an ember. It was a flame. At the centre of this flame stood the loom, not the old loom, brittle and bound by rules, not the broken loom, torn by prophecy and pride, a new loom, a living one. Each thread was not spun by gods, not even by weavers. It was spun by choice. It flickered and snapped with the rhythm of voices, footsteps, ink-stained fingers, battlefield cries and lullabies whispered by mothers who had never prayed. This was not fate. This was the after-fate, and someone had to tend it. On the edge of it stood 3 figures, each with shadow behind them, each with a name once feared, once sung, once lost. Morrígan, Scáthgra, Kale. Not goddesses, not mortals, just the first 3 to step through. The ones who refused to be told, the ones who refused to end. Kale spoke first. "There are no more prophecies." Scáthgra nodded, only questions dressed as scars. The Morrígan placed her hand on the flame, and the flame did not burn her. It revealed her, all of her. The crow who shrieked in blood, the woman who kissed a dying hero, the girl no one held when she was born from the end of war. And the world saw her clearly for the first time, not as wrath, not as doom, as invitation. Across the lands of air and beyond, in quiet places, people began telling stories again. Not of gods, but of becomings. Of the child who left her village to build a library from bones. Of the farmer who made music out of storms. Of the soldier who buried his blade and raised crows instead. They didn't call them myths, they called them possibles. And each one added another thread to the living flame. The gods watched from afar. They were not angry, they were curious. Even Lu, once hungry for glory, began crafting stories with no heroes, just beginnings. Brigid lit fires that warmed, but did not command. And the Dagda. He wept as he walked into a mortal village and planted a seed without magic, just water, soil, and time. One day, a child stood before the flame. She was nameless, wild-eyed, covered in charcoal and feather tattoos. She looked up at Morrígan. "What do I do?" The goddess smiled. "We do not tell you any more." Scáthgra handed the child a spool of thread. Kale whispered, You start with a question, and you pull. The child reached into the flame and spun a thread no one had seen before. It was not red, not gold, not black. It was clear. And when she wove it through the loom, 1,000 doors opened. To lives unimagined, to worlds unspoken, to stories too soft for prophecy, too sharp for fate. And that was the moment the world became storyborn. No longer ruled by fear, no longer worshipping chains, but woven, one thread at a time, by those brave enough to wonder, what happens if I write myself? The flame never went out, because it had never been fire. It was choice. And the last thread, it was not final. It was yours.